Welcome. We've already discussed the ideas of check and checkmate. We know that when the king is checkmated, the game is over. In our earlier examination of checkmate, we encountered a number of positions illustrating the idea of checkmate. What we need to understand and need to learn is how to arrive at those positions. That is, how do we actually deliver checkmate? When we have an overwhelming attack against a king or a significant material advantage, we need to know how to deliver the checkmate. That's what we're going to be covering in this video. So let's get started. In this topic of elementary checkmates, we'll be considering how to checkmate a lone king. This should cause you to ask a question of what is the minimum material needed to checkmate a lone king? Obviously, we're going to need our king. However, we're going to need something to work with the king. We'll need a little bit more. So we could achieve a checkmate. We could force a checkmate with a king and queen against a lone king. A king and rook versus a lone king. A king and a pair of bishops, but they must be of different colors. Remember, a bishop is restricted to one color in terms of the squares that it occupies. Therefore, we'll need both bishops. We also could force a checkmate with a king plus a bishop and knight. Now, because we can force checkmate with bishop and knight, it would seem that we could also accomplish this with two knights. Well, it turns out that checkmate with two knights and a king is possible, but with correct play on the part of our opponent, we cannot force a checkmate. So what's the approach we'll take? Well, in all cases, to checkmate a lone king, the king must be driven to the edge of the board. If we're dealing with a king and queen or king and rook versus the lone king, then checkmate can be delivered along the last rank or file. If we're dealing with the king and a pair of bishops or the king and a bishop and knight, the opponent's king must be driven into a corner in order to be checkmated. Now, before exploring the methods to deliver checkmate, we need to recognize another situation that might arise. If we have the superior forces, this situation that I'm about to describe is not the desired result. Remember that with checkmate, one player wins the game and the other loses. With this situation called stalemate, the game is considered tied. That is, neither player wins, neither player loses the game. Now remember that checkmate is a situation where the king is in check and has no legal way to get out of check. Stalemate occurs when one side is not in check, but cannot make any legal move. So obviously, if you have the superior forces, this outcome would be a disappointment. However, if you have the weaker forces, this could be quite welcome. So remember, checkmate, the result is one player wins, the other player loses. With stalemate, the game is said to be a draw. Neither player wins, neither player loses. So if you have the superior forces, well, stalemate is probably not what you were looking for. Let's take a look at some positions that illustrate the concept of stalemate. First, we have a king and a pawn against the king. This is very common in an endgame. You have a slight advantage. The idea is it's not enough to checkmate, but if you can get the pawn all the way to the last rank and promote it, you could exchange it for a queen, and then you could achieve your checkmate. In the process of getting the pawn to the last rank, obviously the opposing king is going to try to prevent this. So in this particular situation, we have a little bit of a problem if we are actually playing the white pieces. Because if it's black to move, where does the king go? Well, the king cannot go to d8 because the pawn is attacking that square. The king cannot go to f8. The pawn is attacking that square. Likewise, the king cannot go to d7 or f7 because of white's king. Therefore, black has no legal move. This is a stalemate. So that's one example. Probably a fairly common situation to encounter if you're not comfortable in promoting a pawn. Our second example shows another situation. Here, clearly, white has vastly superior forces, sufficient forces to achieve a checkmate. However, again, assuming that it is black to move, the black king has nowhere to go. e1 is attacked by the rook, e1 is attacked by the queen, and the two pieces protect the other two squares of e2 and f2. Black has nowhere to move. The black king is stalemated. The game is a draw. The third situation I'm going to present is slightly different. Here, the black king is not alone. The black king has a bishop. However, the king cannot move because of the opposition with the opponent's king, and the bishop cannot move because if the bishop left the g1 square, the king would suddenly be attacked by the rook over here on a1. Therefore, black is in stalemate. The game is drawn. Remember that the result is considered a tie or a draw. Neither player wins or loses, so definitely not the desired outcome if you have the superior forces. Now let's move on to some of the elementary checkmates. Let's consider the king and queen against the lone king. What we'll do first is examine the types of positions we're trying to reach. That is, what does checkmate look like with the king and queen? In our first position, the white queen is on a square adjacent to the king, and the queen is protected by the white king. Thus we have checkmate. It's similar to the situation we had with the pawn and king versus a king, where we had stalemate, except remember the pawn would have been blocked here and could not advance. But the queen has the ability to move forward and capture what's in front of it. Therefore, the king is in check, hence checkmate. But again, note that the king was driven to the edge of the board, here the last rank. Another possibility is the queen does not have to be on an adjacent square. Here the queen is actually shown on a8. Again, the king cannot move to the 7th rank because of the white king. So therefore, this is one additional type of position, but the queen does not have to go to a8. The queen could have delivered mate from b8, f8, g8, or h8. Any of those squares would have been suitable for delivering the mate in this type of position. So it should be clear from these positions that it is not possible to checkmate the lone king with only the queen. As powerful as the queen may be, it still requires another piece to assist in delivering checkmate. To achieve checkmate against the lone king, using a king and a queen requires that the lone king be driven to the edge of the board. This is accomplished through the combined efforts of the king and the queen. Let's take a look at a position involving king and queen against the king and see how this might actually take place. First, note that the movements of the lone king are already restricted. The idea here is that white's queen has cut off a major portion of the board simply with it being placed at the edge of the board. And the king as well, the white king, is contributing to restrict the movements of the black king. What we wish to do is to further restrict His Majesty's movements, so we play our queen here to d7. Now, the king is going to move closer to the edge of the board. It really doesn't have much of an option. It could try going to e5. If it does this, however, we continue by moving our king, giving the black king fewer choices. It has to return to its original square, and then the white queen is now able to further compress the available space for the black king. So ultimately, the black king will end up at the end of the board. Let's go back for a moment here. Now, after playing queen to d7, let's suppose the king moves to f4. We continue by moving our queen over to the e file, which now is really severely limiting the squares available to black. Black moves to f3. Now the king comes into play. Again, there has to be a cooperation between the king and the queen in order to achieve the checkmate. So the black king continues, go to g3, and now, with the queen going to e2, look at the options available to the black king. These three squares up here on the fourth rank are not available, nor is f3 or f2, g2, h2. At the moment, the king has a single move available to it. It can go to h3. Now let's take a close look at this position. Remember, we had cautioned you about a possibility of falling short of achieving your checkmate. Let's consider where white could move the queen. One option which people might see is, let's continue to compress the available space for the black king, and we might try something like queen to f2. However, if we move queen to f2, where can the black king go? It cannot go to h4, nor can it go to g4, g3, g2, or h2. This, unfortunately for white, is stalemate. So we want to be very careful. This is probably more likely to occur with king and queen against king if you move quickly and don't observe the position carefully. So instead of queen to f2, what we would like to do is move our king. And we move our king to f4. Why do we do that? Well, the queen here is restricting the movement of the black king, and now the king for white is also keeping the black king at the edge of the board. Black has no choice but to move into opposition with the white king. Now white has a couple of choices for checkmate. White could move the queen to g4 and deliver checkmate. White could move the queen to h2 and deliver checkmate. These fall into the categories of the queen and king versus king checkmate positions that we described earlier. So here's one position. Here's the other position. When dealing with king and rook versus king, again, the initial objective is to drive the lone king to the edge of the board. And again, this requires the cooperation of the two pieces. They must work together in order to achieve this objective. So let's take a look from this position as to how we might proceed. Our first step is to get the king into the game. So we move our king. Black attempts to stay in the center. The objective for white in this case is to force the black king to the edge of the board. Black is going to resist as best as possible by trying to remain in the center. Now notice we've yet to move the rook. The idea is because the kings cannot come in direct contact, our king can actually have a significant effect on limiting the scope of the lone king. So we're continuing to do this. Eventually, with black attempting to stay in the center, the kings oppose one another. We have the opposition that we've discussed many times before. At this point, we deliver the check with a rook. The king is then forced to move further away from the white king, driving him toward the edge of the board. Now, once that king has moved, the white king moves closer once again. Eventually, the two kings are going to come into this opposition once again. We deliver another check, forcing the black king back further. And here it is. Check. And now the king is moving closer to the edge of the board. The white king again moves close to the black king. And we continue. Again, the opposition arises. Check. And the king goes back to the edge of the board. Now the white king moves in closer, and we're getting very close to the desired position. Here, if black were to move to h5, it would be easy. We simply move rook to h1, and we have checkmate. So black is going to attempt to survive a bit longer here and moves the king away from the opponent's king. We're in no hurry, so we move our king. And now the rook is attacked. So now we must move our rook. But notice when we move it, the board available to the black king has been reduced to two squares, h1 and h2. King goes to h1. We move our king closer. King goes to h2. Again, we get closer. Finally, the king goes to h1, and now our goal is to attack both h2 and h1 at the same time, and we have checkmate. In most situations, king and rook against a lone king can result in checkmate in perhaps 16 or 17 moves at most. To achieve a checkmate with the king and a pair of bishops against the lone king, we again must drive the king to the edge of the board. But additionally, it's necessary to drive the king into one of the corners. So the bishops and the king must all work together to achieve these goals. Take a look at how we might proceed here. Move the king. Black again attempts to stay in the center. And now something pretty interesting. We move the white squared bishop, and look at how the black squared bishop and the white squared bishop are working together. They have basically sliced the board in half. So now the black king is limited to the queen side of the board. So the king moves. Now the black bishop comes in, and what does it do? It again cutting away at the remaining portion of the board available to the black king. The king continues. Now the two bishops have greatly reduced the amount of space available to the black king. But again, a single bishop can only cover one color square. Therefore, we need the two bishops to work together. And this is a great way to illustrate how the two bishops can work to cooperate to have a strong influence on the movement or the restriction of pieces. Now, here we have a very important situation. It might be tempting to move the king, the white king, to e2, but if we do that, where does the black king go? The bishops have already taken away several squares here, and if we move the king to e2, we've taken away the remaining squares for the black king. We'd actually have a stalemate. So be aware that stalemate is possible here with the bishop pair against the king. So we move the king to e3. This gives black some breathing room, and again we have to force him into a corner, so now he has no choice but to move toward the other corner. Now, how can we ensure that he continues going in that direction and doesn't double back to the queen side? Well, if we move our black squared bishop, we've taken away the square that he just vacated. Again, he's forced to move toward the corner on the king side. He moves forward, take away another square, forcing him to continue in the direction that we'd like him to go. So he moves over, but now notice that if we don't take some action, he's going to get into the second rank and start to move around away from the edge of the board. So how do we stop that? Move the king. So now he's got two choices. He could move back to e1, or he could continue in the direction of the corner. If he moves to e1, well, we can simply check him with the black squared bishop, forcing him again toward the corner. So here he moves to the corner. What do? We move a bishop here. Plenty of time. He starts to make a run for it again. We cut him off. Goes back to the corner. We keep him blocked in with the king. Tries to make a run for it. We check him, forcing him back to the corner. Check. He's ultimately in the corner. Checkmate. So again, there's a fine cooperation with the bishop pair and the king. Notice that the bishops by themselves could not checkmate the king. The king and the bishop pair, all three pieces, are required to deliver the checkmate against the lone king. How often would you encounter an ending of this sort? Perhaps not very often, but it does illustrate the power of the bishop pair, and that's something to be remembered for middle game activity. Let's talk a little bit about checkmate with the king, the knight, and the bishop. This is a much more challenging mate than those we've looked at up to this point. So the lone king can only be mated in a corner of the color controlled by the bishop. This is knowledge that obviously the player with the lone king has, so that player is going to try to go to the other corner. And the real difficulty lies in driving the king from one corner to the other. Typically, this is going to take 34, 35 moves to actually achieve the checkmate. This requires much greater cooperation between the king, the knight, and the bishop than what we may have seen with other pieces. Here's what the final position might look like. Let's set up the board and make some moves that bring us to this position. We're not going to go through the entire driving the king to the back rank or to the edge of the board and to a corner, but let's look at how the mate might be achieved, just so you get a feel for it. Here we have a position that is close to delivering checkmate. Let's play this out and give you the idea of what the final checkmate looks like, and see if we can get some ideas about this type of a checkmate. Okay, the black king is kind of been driven to the back rank and toward the corner that is controlled by the bishop, same color as the bishop. This is where the checkmate is going to be delivered. So the king makes a move, but notice the play of the bishop and the knight. They're restricting the king to this corner at the moment. So white takes advantage of the opportunity to get his king closer. Black tries to keep the king away. White patiently just buys a little bit of time. The king goes back. And now what we do is take away another square. King looks like he's going to get out. The bishop goes down. Now the king is confined here. So what happens is he tries to keep the white king away. Black makes a move with the knight, and we'll see that this is an important move. Now the king makes a move, vacates the knight file. This allows white's king to come in, and now the combination of the pieces has restricted black to two squares, A7 and A8. The king falls back to A8. We check with the bishop. King comes forward, and then we deliver the mate. It looks fairly easy, but it's actually quite complicated because we kind of showed you the end position, not how to arrive there. Let's quickly review what we covered in this video. Our focus was on checkmating the lone king, and we identified the minimal forces that would be needed to be able to force a checkmate against the lone king. We talked about a king and queen versus the king, discussed what the positions would look like, and demonstrated an example of this. We also talked about king and rook versus king, gave a demonstration of how we might accomplish that. King and the bishop pair. And finally, we talked briefly about the king, knight, and bishop combination versus the lone king. We didn't go into great detail on that, but we did provide the basic idea of what needs to be accomplished and showed the final position. One other thing that we talked about during our discussion of these elementary checkmates is that we might not quite achieve our goal and we might stumble upon stalemate. So we discussed how stalemate might occur, what it was, and how this actually could be advantageous to the weaker side, in this case the lone king. It's something you want to understand so that you can avoid it if you have the superior force, but also something you want to be aware of to try to draw upon it as a way of salvaging a lost game and ending up with a draw. Now that we have a pretty good idea of how the pieces work by jumping way to the end and looking at endgames and checkmates, we'll go back and discuss the idea of opening principles. So until next time.